So I want to thank Professor Levine for her introduction. I also really want to thank the graduate student organizers for this event. I organize events, and you did a much better job than I usually do, so I wanted to thank you for that. I think it's been marvelous. And a year ago, I was reflecting on this, a year ago, I was in this room with two colleagues who work on, one colleague who works on the Armenian communities of Lebanon, and another colleague, Mehmet Mekçoğlu, who writes on the elite Armenian women of Istanbul. And it was part of a great conference sort of commemorating the 100th anniversary of the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians. And one of the things that really touched me about that was Lerna and Nicole and I were up here, and the very first question came from someone representing the Turkish community. And they really tore into us, and Lerna let them have it on the way back. But what really touched me were the University of Chicago Turkish Students Association students who came up afterwards and asked how we could help their community understand more about the Armenian genocide. So it was a great rebuke to the kind of denial and hatred that we, and I'm saying that many of you in this room, have been struggling with these issues of denial of violence against Christian and non-Muslim communities for much of your adult and academic careers. But that moment, I think, was very important to me because it was a great pushback. I went on from that conference a couple weeks later, ended up in Istanbul, where I gave one of the first papers on the Armenian genocide at a Turkish university. And no one threw anything at me, no one said boo, and then my wife, the noted Islamic art historian, Elnar Zeytin at Watenpaugh, then gave a presentation in Armenian and Turkish in Taksim Square to a crowd of 6,000 people. So we thought a year ago things were really getting better in Turkey, but those of you who followed it know that hasn't really been the case lately. The other thing is that for the last 3 years I've been working with the Carnegie Corporation and the Institute of International Education on trying to figure out ways to help refugee university students from the war in Syria. And now, unfortunately, we've moved on to also thinking about how we can help students from the conflict in Iraq. And so, as part of that work, we hear these stories of why people are displaced from places like Aleppo or Homs or Damascus. And things just stopped shocking me about Syria after the first couple of years of that work. But one thing that did at least register in my consciousness, and made me quite sad, in fact, was the attack in 2014, November of 2014, on the Armenian church and museum and ossuary at Deir ez-Zor. And these were not Daesh forces, but rather the Nusra forces that blew up this church that had been built on the site of an extermination, the most important extermination camp in the history of the Armenian genocide. And I've been there many times, and in the basement of it were gathered up bones of victims of the genocide that had just sort of littered the Euphrates plain and sort of been bleached by the desert sun for, at that point, 90 years have been gathered there. And those of you who study genocide know that when there's targeting of cultural heritage, it's one of the most important markers for understanding if a genocide is unfolding. So perhaps that's not quite what's happening here, but I want to echo Hannibal's call to think about at least some kind of resonance between 1915 and today. So in my talk, I was going to address briefly what's happening with the Armenian community in Aleppo, some of my thoughts about the future of the Armenians in Syria, but also try to persuade you that there's a reason why we should think about what's happened to the Armenians in Syria as part of a much larger historical process. And also, we should use this moment to reflect upon our reluctance to think about the last 150 years of Middle Eastern history with tools like ideologies of hate and understanding bigotry, forms of chauvinism, and regimes of impunity, something that seems to have been absent from much of our scholarship. So I'll talk about that later. This is, of course, I was there photograph from 1996. And I'd like to say that there's nothing different in either my appearance or my background from that period. There are many things that are gone that were in this picture. My beautiful chestnut gray hair and beard are gone. That disgusting coat I got at Benetton, Aleppo is gone. But also the great minaret of the Umayyad Mosque is gone. And I lived with the Armenian community in Aleppo for a couple of years when I was just a little bit older than the organizers of this conference, while I was working on my doctoral dissertation, which then eventually evolved into my first book, Being Modern in the Middle East, which looks at the Arab Christian and Armenian middle class, primarily in Aleppo. And when I lived there, you already had a sense that the Armenian community in Aleppo wasn't doing too well. And in fact, in the 1990s, very few people in Syria were doing very well at all, unless you were quite wealthy, very close to the regime. The economy was in tatters. Banking and other supply sectors were absolutely non-existent. We used to bring commodities from Turkey into Syria. Lisa was there in those days. She remembers it. I mean, people would want us to bring them coffee and sometimes toilet paper because there were terrible shortages. It was sort of like living in a North Korea with really good food. And but the Armenian community still had a sense of being a community. There were all the tokens of communityness. There were several different kinds of schools in which Armenian was one of the languages of instruction, alongside Arabic, English, and French. There were multiple Armenian churches representing all three of the major Armenian sects, the Catholic, the Apostolic, and the Protestant. There were scout groups, there were basketball teams, there were places of social gathering, both for families, and I always remember that the Tashnaks, or one of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, one of the few political parties that the Armenians were allowed to have in Syria, had the most wonderful sort of rooftop dining area where we could drink alcohol outside. All sorts of things which you can't do in a lot of the rest of the life. So since then, of course, I've kept in touch with my family and friends from the city, and the MESA, Middle East Studies Association meeting before last, a group of us who work on the contemporary Armenian community of Aleppo gathered, and we compared notes. And I think our conclusion was a future for the Armenians of Syria, particularly the Armenians of Aleppo, is magical thinking, that there really is no future. And it's not just the war. The war accelerated a process that in many ways began on April 24, 1915, with the beginning of the Armenian genocide. So we made an estimate, though. I'll give you some numbers. And this is based primarily on conversations between my colleague Simon Payaslian at Boston University and the Patriarchate in Aleppo. The estimate is there's about 2,000 Armenian households left, meaning the household size could range from 1 person to 10, but the idea is that there's probably about 10,000 Armenians left in Aleppo, down from a population high sometime in the late 1970s, early 1980s, of about 100,000 people. And that community, that number, the 100,000 number, take that, and the fact that there were compact Armenian ghettos on the outskirts of the city itself allowed these schools to exist, allowed newspapers and libraries in the Armenian language to persist, Western Armenian to persist. The collapse of the community means that there isn't the cumulative weight of community that will allow those institutions to persist. And so our conclusion was that the Armenians of Aleppo have reached a turning point in which those kinds of tendons that would hold an identifiable community together have broken altogether. Those Armenians who can leave have left. The ones who remain are unable to leave. What's also important to understand is that the city has been essentially abandoned by young people, especially young men, fearing conscription. And if one were to go to the streets of, say, Yerevan today, you would find that the food truck sector of the Yerevan economy is dominated entirely by people from Aleppo, who will probably then eventually run the entire restaurant industry in that country in very short order. Trust me. Old Soviet Armenian food is terrible. So it's been a great blessing for the people of Armenia that all these refugee Armenians have gone. But also young Armenians, for example, the global Armenian community is mobilized on behalf of their university students, providing scholarships for every young Armenian college student from the war in Syria, which also has now been an engine of drawing people out, either to school, universities in Armenia or in Western Europe or the United States. So, I could stop talking now, or I could talk some more. It's a very dark picture, but it's a picture which has its origins not just in the war, as I said before, but has its origins in the long-term effects of genocide on the Armenian people. And so what I'd like to do with the remaining part of my talk is use it as a chance to look at two issues in the broader history of Syria. The first is, how do we account for the role of the Armenians in Syrian society? Where did they come from? And how has the history of Syria, its transformation from a couple provinces of the Ottoman Empire to a French mandate state, to an independent state, and now to a state in civil war. How have the Armenians interacted with that, and how have the politics of that Syria over time impacted the Armenian community? But also, more deeply, and I think this is the spirit of the conference today, which is to think about what we haven't been thinking about in the history of Syria, and in the Middle East more generally, when it comes to the history of non-Muslims, in particular Armenians, Assyrians, Jews, and then also non-Arab Muslim populations, in particular Kurds. So, here we go. The first idea I want to think about is, what are the intellectual tools that we have left to us to look at the history of Syria? The extermination, the contemporary history of Syria, the extermination and displacement of not just minority populations in Syria, but also majority populations in Syria. I can go dark there for a second. Oh, there we go. In Syria, are a real challenge to historians who were trained to look at the Middle East just in the last 20-odd years. The intellectual tools we were given to look at the region were primarily cultural and social. We were never taught how to deal with genocide, refugee flows, and the entire collapse of societies. And this, in fact, I've pursued this because of my own work on genocide and humanitarianism, but by and large, those of us in my cadre and in the succeeding generations of historians, this is not something we ever thought we would have to work on. And we don't have the intellectual, and in fact, sometimes the emotional tools necessarily to do this. And so we're having to find ourselves drawing much more universally, pushing ourselves into a more comparative historical framework where we have to educate ourselves about what it means for a society to collapse or to be destroyed. What is genocide? And how has it affected both residual, survivor communities of genocide, but also communities who may be facing genocide now? So it's very much a critical moment in the history, not just in the study of the history of Syria, but I would say in the study of the Eastern Mediterranean region more generally. And this transition is not going to be made by people who look like me, it's going to be made by the people who helped organize this conference. And they will have to be the pivot around which a new vision of the history of the region emerges. And I would argue, and I'm going to argue in a second here, why a new vision is critically important, not just for good history, but for helping us understand the region as it transitions. So I made a call in my very first book to imagine, it's called Being Modern in the Middle East, to imagine how we as historians could better integrate the history of Armenians, Arab Christians, and Jews into the history of urban Syria. My argument was and is that we needed to move away from an exclusive focus on the history of a post-Ottoman Arab Sunni elite. And this was really an inheritance that we had from the Qurani days and the politics of notables, and really the work of people who came before us like the Khoury, who, when they thought about the history of Syria, and they rightfully focused on the history of Syria as the history of cities, really looked at the most elite members of those cities' populations, and their politics, their cultures, their views of the world. And there was never any real effort to sort of just dig below the surface to other classes. I mean, I didn't dig that much further in my book. I only looked at the middle class. There was still, even further down within the archaeology of these cities, other layers that could be examined. So I argued that if we moved away from looking at an Arab Sunni elite, we could also look at the history of the region through the lens of modernity and class within a framework of nationalism, liberalism, revolution, and colonialism. And I would argue that since then, many of us have done a good job of bringing other groups and classes of society into the history of Syria, but also bringing other communities into the history of Syria. But my argument continued, and this is something that I haven't really emphasized until recently, that the new historiography of the Eastern Mediterranean, if you want to call it, to be successful and actually be of use, must acknowledge how political and social hierarchies in the post-Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean produced ideologies of hate, structures of oppression, and regimes of impunity. And that this had an effect on the history not just of majorities but also of minorities as they interacted with colonial authorities, with Arab authoritarianism, with racialized definitions of citizenship, and then much later kleptocratic mafia regimes like the one in Damascus, and Islamist factions in the current civil war. Now, in this approach, issues and ideas about sectarianism, Sunni chauvinism, the mass enslavement and trafficking of non-Muslim women and children, humanitarian assistance cannot be dismissed as only colonial inventions and the outcome of Orientalist phantasm. And in many ways, the practice that was very much redolent throughout my graduate training and then my early part of my career, this practice of trying to talk around the reality of sectarianism. Saying that sectarianism really isn't there. It's just an invention of the West. It's a minor point in the history of the region. We shouldn't focus too much on it. This trying to talk around sectarianism, which I think we should call something else. We should call it racism or ethnocentrism or hate. And this idea sort of reached its high point in the early 2000s with the publication of Usama Maqdisi's book, The Modernity of Sectarianism. And I should note that even Usama has moved away from some of the ideas in his first book, having witnessed the wars in Syria and Lebanon. But we need to move away to a much more contemporary, historical approach that eschews both forms of Christian and Muslim sort of centrism, but also an Arab nationalist inflected vision as well. Now, I would argue that part of the origin, this would be very provocative here. Why not? It's a warm afternoon. Part of the origin of talking around sectarianism is found in an earlier generation of historians' identification with the heroic narrative of secular Arab nationalism and the intellectuals and politicians that promoted it. In fact, many of the historians and others from that period, who were practicing historians in earlier generations, were involved deeply in those movements, primarily as part of the Palestinian struggle, and sectarianism, like the oppression of women, torture, and so on, was an inconvenient dimension to that narrative. The enormity of changes in the last 15 years points to the failed nature of nationalism and that collective blind spot produced by our colleagues who embraced it. I would argue, as a sort of a side note here, that as a community of scholars, we also must reckon with how that scholarship often drew a real veil over the whole range of human rights abuse practiced by regimes that we failed to criticize or help others oppose. But there's something more to this story, though. And here I don't want to make this argument that past is prologue, because I think that's a terrible historical fallacy. Is that we can use the past, however, in Syria the last 100 years to help us understand the unraveling of societies, but also what it means to live in the post-genocide, of any post-genocide country. And I can go so far as to argue, as friends of mine do, colleagues of mine do in Turkey, that for Armenians in Turkey, there is no post-genocide. It's still continuing. And as I think about the history of Armenians in Syria, I begin to wonder if they too did not live in a post-genocide situation of safety, but only a temporary pause, if you will, in the culmination of the genocide that began in 1915. So in other words, that the destruction and the despoilation and the immigration of the Armenians of Syria, which represent really the last viable community of Anatolian Armenians speaking Western Armenian, writing in Western Armenian, educating their children in Western Armenian, means that the genocide has ultimately succeeded. That attempts at survival and rehabilitation, which I'll talk about in a moment, ultimately have failed. So, in order to do that, I want to focus. How much time do I have, Lisa?
So we started at 2:43. So
Okay. 10, 15, 10 minutes? Okay. 10 minutes, okay. So, what I'd like to do is look at four moments in the history of the Armenians of Syria as a way to contextualize what's happening now, but also try to illustrate this argument about how we can use that past to understand genocide more broadly and displacement as well. And the first of these moments is to understand how the Armenians of Syria entered Syria in the first place. Now, my colleague Elise Semerjian, who I think spent a quarter out here last year, would be very upset with me if I didn't know there have been Armenians in Aleppo and Damascus since the 800s, if not earlier. So, what I'm talking about, but they were tiny populations who, by the time of the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians, had in many ways begun to speak Arabic as their primary language. We call them, when we lived in Aleppo, the old Armenians. The community that is most relevant here, though, are the Armenians who were forcibly displaced as part of genocide from Anatolia and to a much lesser extent from Caucasia. So they, two giant waves, enter into Syria in 1915 and again in 1922. How did the Armenians enter Syria? They didn't enter as invited guests. They didn't enter as well-heeled migrants. They entered as refugees, and perhaps the most abject of refugees. They also entered as freed slaves, and here I have images of some of those freed slaves. This is from the League of Nations archive of the rescue home in Aleppo, where women who had been trafficked during the genocide to Bedouin or Kurdish or Turkish households, and usually enslaved in them, often would try to escape, and those who did so successfully would be taken in a rescue home in the city of Aleppo, sponsored by the League of Nations, where they were photographed and their life stories were written down. Some marvelous stories. I've talked about this here before, for the history of women and children during the Armenian genocide. But the stories are very similar in that they discuss the sort of forced marriage, forced early marriage, rape, physical and sexual abuse, and so on. These women entered Syrian society not as having freed themselves from slavery, which wasn't necessarily viewed in the majority society as a heroic gesture. But they still were somehow not quite human upon their entry into Aleppo. Others entered as as objects of humanitarianism, a phrase that I developed in my second book, in which their mere existence could not take place without the assistance of organizations like Near East Relief, the American Red Cross, or the League of Nations. They were utterly and totally dependent upon humanitarianism. And in fact, I've proposed a word to explain that status, which is khalia, which is an Armenian word meaning those who have been, meaning shipwrecked, or the shipwrecked. And in many ways, the Armenians who entered Syria did so as people who were the equivalent of a wrecked ship on a beach. That there was nothing left but their bare bones. And I want to do this to abandon this Agamba notion of this sort of the person stripped of being. And this entry into Syria meant that Armenians were viewed by the majority community in all sorts of very negative ways. They were viewed as subordinates, as possible slaves, as an exploitable mass, whose humanity was questionable at best. And we can see this in much of the writing at the time. Often you'll see discussions in sort of the elite Arab press and others saying that we would never do to the Armenians what the Turks did, which was less about the Armenians and more about trying to create a new Arab identity. And then later on we see the vilification of the Armenians, especially as they're given political status and they're made citizens of Syria, which brings me to sort of the next point, which is the other way that Syrians entered Syria, which is the definitive settlement process. Sometime in the mid-1920s, well, not sometime, after the government of Turkey denationalized all Armenians living outside of its borders, it became very clear that the Armenians were not, that had gathered in Aleppo and Beirut and Damascus, weren't going to go home. You know, I work so much with refugees now. There's always this sense that they're supposed to go home, right? But very few refugees ever end up going home, which is one of the reasons why you want to prevent refugees from being created in the first place. So the possibility that refugees go home even now is very remote. And in fact, most refugees remain unsettled for about 18 years before they find any form of permanent settlement. The situation was true for Armenians. When they first entered Syria, the idea was that they would be rehabilitated and brought back into Anatolia. They would be rehabilitated and brought back into Anatolia. By the mid-1920s, this was gone as an option. The state of Turkey had closed the borders for their return, and the international community, as I discussed in a recent article in the journal Humanity, embraced this idea of responsibility for settling the Armenians. But where? And under what terms? In Syria and Lebanon, they were settled from the perspective of the French-mandated authorities as a tool to increase a non-Arab, non-nationalist voting bloc in any future elections, which of course created them as in many ways a proxy enemy of French nationalism in the region for the Arab Sunni elite. And if you read the newspaper accounts of the time, you'll see these wonderful headlines like, "The Zionists are better than the Armenians." And also, you know, "Those French brought all these Christians into our country and now they're making us live with them." So this is also illustrative, this image is illustrative of the disparity that Aleppans might have seen. This is from as Armenians settled Aleppo, they settled on the outskirts of the city in camps, as refugees are wont to do. So after a while, and we know this, those of you who've ever visited the Zaatari camp, for example, in northern Jordan, you know, tents make way to more permanent settlements, and then they make way to brick and mortar houses, and they make way to paved streets. Well, this is the end product of that in Aleppo. In this case, however, the international community in the role of the League of Nations helped the Armenians of Aleppo build extremely nice modern homes in their suburban neighborhood, complete with, at the time, indoor plumbing and electricity, something that was exceedingly rare in the rest of Aleppo proper. So again, resentment and so on took place. But another part of that international community's idea was maintaining the Armenians as a distinct community. And this wasn't just part of a French colonial plan of divide and conquer. This was actually a plan of the United Nations that saw the recovery of the Armenians as an act of confronting, not, you know, the word genocide hadn't been coined yet, but in confronting the act of genocide itself. That cultural survival was critical. And so there was this international sanction for keeping the Armenians from integrating more thoroughly and more naturally into Arab Syria, which kept them apart. Language, schools, and so on, and political parties and organizations became very distinct in places like Aleppo, which marked the Armenians as different, as a very different group. Which would take, and I don't have a good image for this next point, but the Armenians, you know, successfully navigated and negotiated both the end of French colonialism and the beginning of Syrian independence. But a critical turning point occurs in the 1960s with the rise of Nasserism and the unity between the brief, momentary unification of Syria and Egypt. Imagine if that could happen today. Of Syria and Egypt, where a different definition of citizenship was imposed upon Syria, a much more sort of Arabized definition on Syria, which had resisted much of that previously. And the Armenians were forced to abandon many of their cultural institutions and Arabize them. So for example, they used to have a club called the Ararat Basketball Club, and they had to rename it the Yarmouk Basketball Club. They got around that by putting Ararat and Armenian on the front of the jersey and Arabic Yarmouk on the back of the jersey. You got to do what you got to do. But this had a much more important problem, is it defined citizenship in Syria, I can see your name. It defined citizenship in Syria as racial, as an Arab race. And this was reinforced by the end of the 1960s by the embrace by Alawite Baathism of a much more racialized notion of what it meant to be Arab. And so, of course, Armenians were left out on two counts, language and putative race, that they were neither Arab nor, well, they weren't Arab nor were they Arabic speakers by and large. So let me just conclude back to this image of the destruction of the church and museum in Deir ez-Zor. And I was very much inspired by some of Hannibal's observations. And we've seen these parallels, those of us who are sensitive to this issue have seen these parallels emerge over and over again, especially at the time of the genocide of the Yazidis in Jebel Sinjar. The genocide of 1915, however, laid the groundwork in Syria for the creation of a community that could never quite integrate, whose inability to, and not just their inability, but the inability of a larger society to integrate and embrace them. And this was in part because of prevailing attitudes that we can describe as sectarianism, to forms of Sunni chauvinism, to Arab nationalism, but also to the nature of any community of survivors trying to make their way in an alien community. And that 100 years has drawn to an end, and that community is vanishing, which tells me that often efforts that we take to try to address the suffering of genocide, especially in its aftermath, are so difficult and have such a small, their chance of success is relatively small, that we should really be focusing our efforts elsewhere, primarily on the prevention of genocide and interventions to prevent crimes against humanity. Syria tells us that. And what we're witnessing now, and I speak not just of the minority communities, but majority community, everyone as well, is that we are laying the groundwork, this failure to effectively address the humanitarian dimensions of the war in Syria is laying the groundwork for another 100 years of suffering. And that there is something obscene in the failure of the international community to do so. Thank you.